Late on a Friday night, alone in my workshop, I got a text from my son. "Don't come to Leo's celebration. The guests are all business contacts. You'd make things uncomfortable." No apology. I called back. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail with 3 words. "I understand. Goodbye." Then I went back to the wood and worked until morning. 2 days later, my son called again, his voice completely unraveled. It turned out they had just seen the magazine. "Welcome to Silent Sweet Revenge. I appreciate your presence more than you know. Where in the world are you watching from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments. Please note, certain parts of this story have been dramatized for entertainment. Any resemblance to actual names or events is coincidental, but the core lesson is very practical." I finished the cradle at 4:37 in the morning. I know the exact time because the old clock above the workbench had been running 3 minutes fast for the past 6 years, and I had never bothered to fix it. 4:40 on the clock meant 4:37 in the real world, a small private truth that only mattered to me, in a workshop that only mattered to me, on a morning when no one else in Millbrook, Virginia was awake to see what I had made. I set down the smoothing plane and stepped back to look at it properly. The cradle was made from white oak and eastern white pine oak for the frame because oak does not warp pine for the body panels, because pine breathes, because pine holds warmth, the way good wood is supposed to hold it. I had started the joinery 6 weeks earlier after Julian called to tell me that Cassandra had gone into labor. I had driven to the hospital that afternoon, 2 hours each way on Route 60, radio off, window cracked, and I had sat in the corridor outside the maternity ward for 4 hours before a nurse came out and told me the baby had arrived healthy, 7 pounds and 4 ounces a boy. Julian came out 20 minutes after that. He looked tired in the bright, scattered way that new fathers look tired, not the bone-deep kind, but the kind that still has happiness underneath it. He shook my hand. Not an embrace, a handshake, firm and brief, the way you greet a colleague you see twice a year. "Leo," he said. "We're calling him Leo." "That's a good name," I told him. "You can come back next week," he said. "We need a few days to get settled." I drove home the same way I had come, Route 60, radio off, window cracked. And when I got back to the workshop, I turned on the bench light and started drawing measurements on a piece of paper. I did not let myself think about what I was doing or why. I just drew the measurements and pulled out the oak boards I had been seasoning for 2 years in the back corner, and I started. "Arthur?" Dorothy Calloway's voice came through the workshop door before she did, which was her way. Dot had lived in the yellow house next to my property for 11 years. Her husband Gerald had passed in 2019, and after that she had taken up the habit of walking over in the mornings with 2 cups of coffee, one for her and one for whoever happened to be in my workshop. She never asked to be invited. She had decided somewhere along the way that checking on me was simply something she did the way other people checked their mail or watered their plants. She pushed the door open with her shoulder, both hands wrapped around the 2 mugs, and stopped when she saw the cradle sitting on the workbench under the light. "Oh, Arthur." Her voice changed in the way voices change when they encounter something unexpected and beautiful. She crossed the workshop slowly, set my coffee down beside the cradle, and ran one finger along the curved oak rail. "You made this yourself. Who else would have made it? Don't be smart with me at 5 in the morning." She leaned down and looked at the dovetail joints at the corner of the frame, the ones I had cut by hand rather than with the router, because hand-cut dovetails fit tighter and last longer, and I wanted this to last. "These are hand-cut?" "Yes. Gerald couldn't cut a dovetail joint to save his life," she said, with the particular fondness that widows use when they speak about the things their husbands could not do. "He always said the rotor was good enough." She straightened up and looked at me, When are you taking it over? This morning. She nodded slowly. She picked up her own coffee and wrapped both hands around the mug, the way she did when she was thinking something she wasn't sure whether to say. Then she said it anyway, because Dot always said things anyway. Has Julian asked for it? No. Did he ask you to make it? No. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the first birds had started in the oak tree by the fence, the same cardinal that came every March, the male with the red so bright it looked almost painted. He's going to love it, Dot said finally. The baby. Leo. She said the name like she was trying it out. Leo is going to love sleeping in this. I picked up my coffee and drank it standing up the way I always drank my first cup of the morning. The cradle sat between us under the bench light, smelling of fresh-cut pine and the linseed oil I had rubbed into the panels the night before. I had spent 3 hours on the finish alone, 4 coats of oil hand-buffed between each one, because the finish on a piece of furniture is the part that protects everything underneath it. You know what I was thinking about last night? I said. What? Julian was 8 years old, and he came in here one Saturday morning while I was working on a commission, a dining table for a family, over in Charlottesville. He picked up a piece of scrap pine and asked me if he could make something. I gave him a handsaw and a few nails and showed him how to square a corner. I paused. He made a small box, completely crooked. The lid didn't fit right and one side was half an inch shorter than the other. He was so proud of that box that he carried it to school in his backpack for a week. Dot smiled. What happened to it? I don't know, I said honestly. I kept it on the shelf over there for years. I nodded toward the far wall. At some point it was just gone. The cardinal called once from the oak tree outside, a single sharp note, clean and carrying in the cool morning air. I set down my coffee mug. I found a moving blanket on the lower shelf and folded it carefully around the cradle, tucking the corners in tight so the oak rails wouldn't shift during the drive. I'll be back by noon, I told Dot. She held the workshop door open for me while I carried the cradle to the truck, steadying it with both hands on the turns. When I had it secured in the bed, she stood at the end of the driveway with her coffee mug and looked at me with an expression I recognized, the one she used when she wanted to say something but had decided it was not her place. I climbed into the cab, started the engine, and pulled out onto the road toward Richmond. The cradle rode in the truck bed behind me, wrapped in its blanket, solid and still smelling of pine and linseed oil, and 6 weeks of early mornings. In my chest, something sat quietly, not quite hope, not quite nervousness. Something that had not yet decided what it was. I drove east on Route 60 as the sun came up over the Virginia hills, and I told myself the drive was nothing. Just a father bringing a gift to his son's house. Just a grandfather taking something he made to the boy who would sleep in it. I had been telling myself things like that for a long time. I was good at it. I had practice. Julian and Cassandra lived in Westfield Hills, a neighborhood in the western part of Richmond, where the houses sat back from the street behind manicured hedges and the driveways were paved in herringbone brick. I had been there twice before, once when they moved in 18 months ago, and once at Christmas when I stayed for 40 minutes and left with a tin of cookies Cassandra had apparently purchased from a bakery and rewrapped in foil so they would look homemade. I had not said anything about that. It was not the kind of thing worth saying anything about. I pulled the truck up to the curb rather than the driveway. The driveway was for people who were expected. Julian answered the door on the second knock. He was wearing a collared shirt, already at 9 in the morning, on a Saturday, which told me he was either expecting someone else or had simply become the kind of man who dressed like he was expecting someone else at all times. He looked at me first. Then he looked past me at the truck. Then he looked at the moving blanket in the truck bed and the shape of what was underneath it. Dad. He said it the way people say a word when they are buying themselves a second to think. I didn't know you were coming. I called Thursday, I said. You didn't pick up. I've been slammed at work. He stepped back to let me in, not fully, just enough. What's in the truck? Something for Leo. Let me bring it in. He followed me to this truck and watched me lift the cradle out of the bed, still wrapped in the moving blanket. It was heavier than it looked, solid oak frame, the kind of weight that means something was built to last. I carried it up the front walk and into the entryway, and I set it down on the marble floor and pulled the blanket away. The cradle sat there under the entryway, light white oak frame, pine body panels, the color of warm honey, the curved rockers. I had steam bent over 3 separate sessions because the first 2 had cracked, and I had started over without telling anyone. The dovetail joints at the corners were tight and clean. The finish caught the light, the way good oil-rubbed wood catches light, not shiny, but deep, like something that had been patient for a long time. Julian looked at it. I watched his face do its calculation, the slight tightening around his eyes, the small compression of his mouth that he had been doing since he was a teenager, whenever he encountered something he needed to find a polite way around. You made this, he said. Yes. By hand. That's generally how it's done. He crouched down and looked at one of the corner joints, and for just a moment, something crossed his face that I recognized, the same expressions he had worn at 8 years old, standing in the workshop, holding a crooked pine box, looking at what his hands had made, and feeling the specific pride of having built something real. Then the moment passed and he stood up and the calculation came back. Dad, it's a beautiful piece of work, it really is. He put his hands in his pockets. But Cassandra's parents already had the nursery set up. The crib came from a specialty importer in New York. Italian manufacturer, solid beach, the whole thing. He paused. It really wouldn't fit the aesthetic of the room. I looked at the cradle. Then I looked at my son. The aesthetic of the room, I said. I'm not trying to be dismissive. His voice had taken on the careful tone of a man who has practiced this particular kind of conversation. It's just that everything in Leo's nursery is already coordinated. Cassandra spent months on it. If I bring in a... He stopped, seemed to choose his next word with some effort. A different piece, it's going to create a problem I don't need right now. Cassandra appeared at the top of the stairs then. She was dressed in a cream blouse and dark slacks, her dark hair pulled back, and she looked at the cradle the way people look at things they have already decided are not for them. Her gaze moved from the cradle to me, and she produced a smile that was technically a smile. Arthur, she said, coming down the stairs. We weren't expecting you. I should have called ahead, I said. I brought something for Leo. She looked at the cradle again briefly. That's very thoughtful. She touched Julian's arm just lightly, which I understood was a signal of some kind. Sweetheart, maybe we can find a spot for it in storage for now until we figure out the right place. Julian nodded with the quick relief of a man who has been offered an exit. Yeah, absolutely. We've got room in the basement storage area. It'll be safe down there. I wanted to say something then. I could feel the words stacking up behind my teeth, not angry words, just true ones. I wanted to say that I had steam bent those rockers 3 times, because the first 2 cracked, and that the oil finish had taken 4 coats and 12 hours of work, and that white oak does not warp in humidity the way beech does, which meant this cradle would outlast the Italian import by 40 years. I wanted to say that I had sat in a hospital corridor for 4 hours the night Leo was born, and that this was the only thing I had been able to think to do with that feeling. I didn't say any of it. There is a kind of silence that is not defeat, it is economy. You learn at 68 which words will land, and which words will simply fall to the floor between you and another person, and lie there costing you both something without changing anything. I had learned that a long time ago. I just hadn't always practiced it. "The basement is fine," I said. Julian carried the cradle downstairs himself, which I thought was either courtesy or guilt, probably both. When he came back up, he was straightening his collar. "You want coffee?" he asked. "No, thank you. Leo's sleeping right now, but you could." "I won't wake him." I picked up the moving blanket from the entryway floor and folded it under my arm. I just wanted to drop it off. Cassandra had moved into the kitchen doorway, one hand resting on the frame. She said pleasantly, "It was good to see you, Arthur." "You too," I said, because there was no other reasonable answer. Julian walked me to the door. On the porch, he reached into his back pocket and produced a folded check. He held it out to me, not awkwardly, which was the part that stayed with me afterward. He held it out like it was a normal thing, the natural conclusion to the transaction. "Get yourself something," he said, "for the materials and the time." I looked at the check. I looked at my son's hand holding it. His fingers were steady, which told me he had thought about this moment beforehand and prepared for it, which meant the check had not been an impulse. It had been a plan. "Keep it," I said. "Dad, keep it. Julian." I walked down the porch steps and back to the truck. I drove 2 blocks before I pulled over, not because I needed to, but because my hands had started to ache, the way they always ached in cold weather, and I wanted to flex them before I got back on the highway. I sat there on the quiet residential street and flexed my hands on the steering wheel one at a time and looked at the moving blanket on the passenger seat. The blanket that had carried the cradle here and would carry nothing home. Down in that basement in the dark, the white oak and pine sat waiting in the careful quiet of something built to last. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road. 2 weeks passed the way weeks pass when you are 68 years old and live alone, not quickly, not slowly, but with a kind of steady weight like water moving through a wide, flat river. I worked in the shop. I finished the cabinet for the family on Elm Street. I started a side table commissioned by a woman in Charlottesville who had seen my work at a neighbor's house and called 3 times before I agreed to take the job. I did not call Julian. He did not call me. On the Wednesday of the 2nd week, I drove to Westfield Hills again. I told myself I was going to see Leo. That was the whole truth of it. I wanted to see the boy. I parked on the street again. The herringbone brick driveway held 2 cars today, Julian's silver Audi and a black Mercedes with a personalized plate that read STRLNG1. I did not know that plate yet. I would learn it shortly. I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. No one answered for long enough that I considered leaving. Then through the tall, narrow window beside the front door, I saw movement, Julian crossing the entryway. He stopped when he saw me through the glass. Something moved across his face there, and gone so fast I might have imagined it if I had been the kind of man who imagined things. He opened the door 4 inches. "Dad." His voice was low and tightly controlled. "You didn't call." "I wanted to see Leo. This isn't a good time." He glanced back over his shoulder into the house. "We have company." "I don't need to stay long," I said. 10 minutes. "Dad." The word came out harder this time with a kind of pressure behind it, like something being held shut. I said it's not a good time. I looked past his shoulder into the living room. Through the wide doorway, I could see a portion of the sitting area. The cream sofa, the low-glass table, and in the leather armchair near the fireplace, a man I had never met, sitting with his legs crossed, and a crystal glass of something amber balanced on his knee. He was perhaps 60, heavy across the shoulders with the careful grooming of a man who considered his appearance a professional matter. He was reading something on his phone and had not looked up. Beside the armchair on the hardwood floor, Julian's shoeshine kit sat open the wooden box he had apparently purchased at some point. Because Julian had not owned a shoeshine kit when he lived in my house, I was certain of that. And kneeling on the floor next to the box with a soft cloth in one hand and a tin of dark wax in the other was my son. He had been kneeling there when I rang the bell. He had crossed the entryway and opened the door, and now he needed to go back because the man in the armchair had not acknowledged the interruption and was clearly not going to. I stood on the porch and looked at my son's face and understood the whole geometry of it in one long quiet moment, the way you understand a woodworking problem when you finally see the grain running in the wrong direction. The man in the chair was Richard Sterling, Julian's father-in-law, the man whose daughter Julian had married and whose approval Julian had apparently decided was worth kneeling on a hardwood floor to maintain. "You should go back inside," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Don't let me interrupt." Relief crossed Julian's face so fast it hurt to see. "I'll call you this week, Dad. I promise. We'll set up a proper visit." "Sure," I said. "And Dad?" He lowered his voice further, almost to nothing. "Please don't mention that you stopped by. It would just complicate things right now." I looked at my son for a moment. He was 38 years old. He had my mother's eyes and his mother's jaw, and somewhere inside him was the 8-year-old boy who had carried a crooked pine box to school in his backpack for a week because he had built it himself, and he was proud of it. I looked for that boy in his face, and I could not find him. "I won't mention it," I said. Julian nodded quick and grateful and eased the door shut. I walked back down the porch steps. My left knee had been giving me trouble since February. A stiffness that worsened in cold weather, the kind of thing you ignore until you can't, and I felt it on every step down. At the bottom I stopped and turned around, not back toward the house, but toward my truck, and I caught my own reflection in the driver's side window as I approached. An old man in a canvas jacket standing on a quiet Richmond street in the pale afternoon light, looking at himself in a truck window. I climbed in. I sat. The engine ticked in the cold. Richard Sterling had not looked up from his phone once. Not when the doorbell rang, not when Julian crossed the room, not during the whole long minute of conversation at the door. He had simply sat in the armchair with his crystal glass and let the interruption work itself out the way men do when they are absolutely certain the world will arrange itself around their comfort. I thought about Leo upstairs in that house. 6 weeks old, sleeping in an Italian crib in a room I had never been allowed to see. I thought about the white oak cradle sitting in the basement in the dark. Then I started the engine. I drove home on Route 60 with the heat running and both hands on the wheel. When I got back to the workshop, I went straight to the workbench, picked up the smoothing plane, and went back to work on the Charlottesville side table. The wood was cherry, close-grained, and cooperative, the kind of material that rewards patience. I worked until the light outside the workshop windows went from gold to gray to nothing, and I did not stop until Dot knocked on the door at 7 o'clock, with a plate of food she said she had made too much of. I did not tell her where I had been. She did not ask. She sat on the old stool by the door and talked about the cardinal and the weather and a movie she had watched the night before, and I listened and ate her food and was grateful in a way I could not have put into words that she was there. That night, I lay awake in the dark for a long time staring at the ceiling, not because I was angry. I understood anger was clean, anger had direction. What I felt was something older and more shapeless. The particular weight of a man who has seen something true about his son and cannot unsee it and does not yet know what to do with the seeing. My phone sat on the nightstand. Julian's name was in it. I did not reach for it. The message came in at 10:14 on a Friday night, while I was sitting in the workshop, reading a woodworking magazine I had already read twice. I was not waiting for anything. That is important to say because later I would wonder whether some part of me had been expecting this, whether the whole quiet accumulation of the past weeks had been building towards something I already knew was coming. But the honest answer is no. I was sitting in the workshop at 10:14 on a Friday night, reading a magazine I had already read twice, because that was simply what I did on Friday nights, and I was not expecting anything at all. The phone buzzed against the workbench. I picked it up. The message was from Julian. "Dad, don't come to Leo's 1-month celebration next Saturday. The guest list is already set. Cassandra's family has organized everything, and the people attending are mostly Richard's business contacts and some local officials. It wouldn't be the right environment. You'd be uncomfortable. I'll bring Leo by the workshop sometime soon so you can spend some time with him there." I read it once. Then I read it again. Then I set the phone face down on the workbench and looked at the wall in front of me, the pegboard where I keep my hand tools, the chisels and gouges arranged by size, the card scrapers hanging on their nails. Everything in its place the way I have kept it for 30 years. I looked at all of that for a while without really seeing any of it. You'd be uncomfortable. He had not written, "We don't want you there." He had not written, "My father-in-law doesn't know who you are, and I am not going to explain." He had written, "You'd be uncomfortable," which was a way of making his decision sound like a consideration for my feelings, which was, I thought, perhaps the most Julian thing he had ever said to me. I picked up the phone and called his number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. His recorded voice, professional and warm in the way that people practice being warm when they know they are being recorded. "You've reached Julian Miller. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." I waited for the beep. "Julian," I said. "It's your father. I got your message." I stopped there for a moment because I wanted to be careful about what came next, not for his sake, but for my own. There are things you say in the heat of a moment that you spend years wishing you could unsay, and I was 68 years old, and I had learned that lesson in enough different ways that I no longer needed to keep learning it. "I understand," I said finally. "I won't come to the celebration. I hope Leo has a good day." 3 seconds of silence. "Take care of yourself." I ended the call and put the phone back on the workbench face down again. Then I sat in the workshop for a long time without moving. The thing about being a father, the thing nobody warns you about when you are young enough that the warning might have been useful, is that the hurt does not always feel like hurt. Sometimes it feels like weather. A pressure system moving through you, neither here nor there, just present. You breathe through it the way you breathe through a change in temperature, because there is nothing else to do, and because the alternative is to stop breathing, which is not an option. I thought about the night Julian was born. I had paced the waiting room of Roanoke Memorial for 6 hours back and forth across the linoleum in my work boots, until the doctor came out and told me I had a son. I had stood in that waiting room and felt something crack open in my chest, not painful, just open the way a window opens onto air you didn't know you'd been missing. I had driven home from that hospital thinking I understood what my life was for. That had been 38 years ago. I sat in the workshop and did the arithmetic of it. 38 years, the whole long corridor of them. The Little League games and the school projects, and the arguments about curfews, and the drive to drop him at college in Charlottesville, where he cried in the parking lot and made me promise not to tell anyone, and I tried to locate somewhere in all of that distance the exact moment when things had turned the direction they had turned. I could not find it. Maybe there was no single moment. Maybe it was like wood grain. The direction is always there, running through the whole piece, and you only see it clearly when you cut across it. At 11:30, I got up and went inside and put the kettle on. While I waited for it to boil, I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the workshop, the lights still on inside the small rectangle of yellow in the dark yard. Thomas Briggs had been my friend for 40 years. We had met in 1985 when we were both junior staff at the Virginia Department of General Services, he in planning me and inspections, and we had risen through those years together. Parallel tracks, different bureaus, the same core conviction that the work mattered and that doing it honestly was not optional. He had retired 2 years before I did and moved to a smaller house in Crozet, 30 minutes west. We talked on the phone every few weeks. We had lunch twice a year. I had never called Thomas at 11:30 at night. I had never needed to. I picked up the phone and dialed. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had not been asleep. Which was the thing about Thomas, he kept the same hours I did, which was to say, the hours of men who had spent decades on call and never fully stopped being on call, even after there was nothing left to be on call for. Arthur. His voice was alert, not groggy. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, I said, and then stopped, because that was not entirely accurate. I need you to come to the workshop tomorrow morning. Bring your briefcase. A pause. Thomas had known me long enough to understand what a briefcase meant when I asked him to bring it. What time? He said. 9 o'clock. I'll be there, he said without asking anything else. That was the thing about 40 years of friendship. You accumulate enough history that certain requests don't require explanation. He knew I would explain in the morning. He also knew from the tone of my voice at 11:30 on a Friday night that whatever had happened was serious enough that I had already made up my mind about what came next. I hung up and poured my tea and stood at the kitchen window for a while longer, looking at the light in the workshop. Outside, the night was very still. No wind, no traffic on the road, just the dark and the cold, and the small yellow rectangle of the workshop window, holding its light steady against all of it. I drank my tea and went to bed. I did not sleep for a long time. But when sleep finally came, it came cleanly, the way sleep comes when you have made a decision and the making of it has settled something that needed to be settled. Tomorrow, Thomas was coming with his briefcase. That was enough for now. Thomas Briggs arrived at 9 o'clock exactly, which was the only way Thomas ever arrived anywhere. I had the coffee ready and the workbench cleared. He pulled up in his old Subaru wagon, the same one he had driven for 11 years, because Thomas was the kind of man who found something reliable and stayed with it, and came through the workshop door with his leather briefcase in one hand and a paper bag from the bakery in Crozet in the other. I stopped for muffins, he said, setting the bag on the workbench. Blueberry. Don't argue. I wasn't going to argue. He looked around the workshop the way he always did when he visited, slowly taking inventory, like a man reassuring himself that everything was still in its right place. Then he looked at me. Thomas had a way of looking at people that had nothing to do with judgment and everything to do with attention. After 40 years in government service, 31 of them in senior positions, he had developed the particular skill of seeing exactly what was in front of him without adding anything that wasn't there. You look like you slept about 4 hours, he said. 5, I said. Maybe. He pulled the stool up to the workbench and sat down, unlatching the briefcase. Tell me what happened, I told him. All of it, the cradle, the storage room, the visit. 2 weeks later, Julian on his knees on the hardwood floor, and then the text message at 10:14 on a Friday night. I told it the way I told most things, which is to say without ornamentation, just the sequence of events in the order they had occurred, because that is usually enough. Thomas listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, his hands flat on the briefcase lid. How long has it been like this? He asked. Getting worse for about 2 years, I said, since he married Cassandra and moved into that house. But the direction has been there longer than that. Thomas nodded. He opened the briefcase and took out a legal pad and a pen. All right, he said. Walk me through what you want to do. What I wanted to do was straightforward, though. The mechanism for doing it required care. Under Virginia law and under the laws of most states, a person has the right to modify or revoke a will at any time provided they are of sound mind, and the document is properly witnessed and notarized. I was of sound mind. Thomas was a licensed attorney in the Commonwealth of Virginia, though he had practiced only briefly before moving into public administration, and he had kept his bar membership current out of what he called professional stubbornness. The core of what I wanted was this: I wanted to establish a revocable living trust with Leo as the sole beneficiary. A trust rather than a simple bequest in a will, because a trust takes effect immediately upon my death and does not pass through probate, the court-supervised process that can take months or years, and during which assets are vulnerable to claims and disputes. More importantly, for my purposes, a trust meant that Julian would have no automatic role in managing Leo's inheritance. I would name Thomas as trustee, the person legally responsible for managing and distributing the trust assets according to my instructions, until Leo reached the age of 25. The trust would be funded primarily by the savings account I had maintained for 30 years, currently holding $212,000 accumulated from 3 decades of government salary carefully managed and never touched. Julian did not know this account existed. I had never seen a reason to mention it, and now I was grateful for that omission. You understand, Thomas said, pen moving on the legal pad, that once this is executed, Julian has no claim on these assets. Not now, not after you're gone, not under any circumstance short of a successful legal challenge, which he would not win. I understand. And you're certain? I picked up my coffee mug. I've been certain since 10:15 last night. Thomas looked at me over the top of his reading glasses, the half-moon kind he had started wearing 3 years ago, and complained about constantly. I'm not going to try to talk you out of it, he said. I just need to ask once. You asked. The answer is yes. He wrote for a while. Outside the morning was clear and cold, the kind of March Saturday in Virginia that can't make up its mind about the season, bright sunlight through windows that do nothing to cut the chill. I refilled both our coffees and ate one of the blueberry muffins and watched Thomas work the familiar scratch of his pen on legal paper. The occasional pause where he would tap the pen twice against the pad, the way he had always done when he was thinking through a construction he wanted to get right. At 10:45, he produced 2 copies of the completed document. A revocable living trust for the benefit of Leo Alexander Miller with Thomas Briggs named as trustee and successor trustee. He walked me through it section by section, the asset schedule, the distribution provisions, the conditions under which the trustee could release funds before Leo reached 25 for purposes of education or medical necessity. He explained each clause in plain language before asking me to confirm I understood it, which was how Thomas had always worked, because he believed that a document a person didn't fully understand was not a document they had truly signed. I understood all of it. I signed both copies. Thomas signed as witness. The notarization he would handle at his office in Crozet on Monday morning. When it was done, he gathered the documents into the briefcase and latched it shut with the small, decisive click it always made. We sat for a moment without talking, drinking our coffee. The workshop was quiet except for the birds outside and the occasional settling sound of the old building adjusting to the morning temperature. Thomas set his mug down and looked at the far corner of the workshop, where the white oak cradle sat on its side against the wall, still showing the marks of the moving blanket straps. He looked at it for a long moment. That the cradle? He said. Yes. Leo's going to sleep well in that, he said. White oak doesn't move. I had a white oak floor put in my kitchen 12 years ago. Hasn't shifted 1/8 of an inch. I know, I said. He stood and picked up his briefcase. I walked him to the door, and we shook hands on the threshold, the way we always did, firm, brief, the handshake of two men who had been shaking hands for 40 years and didn't need to make anything more of it than it was. "Call me if you need anything," he said. I nodded. He walked to the Subaru and drove away. I stood in the workshop doorway for a moment after his car disappeared, looking at the empty road. Then I turned back inside. On the workbench, the two blueberry muffins Thomas hadn't eaten sat in the paper bag, and beside the workbench, the morning mail had arrived while we were working a small stack of catalogs and envelopes that the postal carrier had pushed through the slot in the workshop door, the way he always did on Saturdays. On top of the stack was a magazine I had not ordered and did not recognize. A glossy cover architecture and urban planning, the kind of publication that circulated in professional circles I had left behind 5 years ago. I picked it up without thinking, the way you pick up anything that lands in your hands unexpectedly. Then I saw the photograph on the cover, and I stopped. The man on the cover was younger by 20 years, but the face was unmistakably mine. I stood in the workshop doorway, holding the magazine with both hands, looking at a photograph I had completely forgotten existed. It had been taken at the signing ceremony for the Interstate Corridor Expansion Project. March of 2004, the rotunda at the state capitol, the governor in his navy suit standing to my left, my right hand reaching across the table toward the document that would authorize the largest infrastructure project in Virginia's history at that time. I was wearing my good gray suit, the one I had bought specifically for occasions that required a good gray suit, and I was looking at the camera with the expression of a man who understood that the moment mattered and was trying to behave accordingly. The headline beneath the photograph read, "Integrity's Architect, the inspector who held Virginia's future to account." I carried the magazine to the workbench and sat down on the stool Thomas had vacated 20 minutes earlier, the seat still faintly warm. I opened to the article. It ran 11 pages with photographs I recognized, and some I didn't project sites. Ceremony snapshots, a copy of a commendation letter from the governor's office that I had not known anyone had kept. The writer had interviewed former colleagues, contractors whose projects I had approved, and at least 2 people whose projects I had not approved, which I thought showed a certain journalistic fairness. The central claim of the piece was straightforward, that in 27 years as a state building and infrastructure inspector, rising to Chief Inspector of the Commonwealth, Ohio, approved a project that failed to meet code and had not once accepted consideration, money gifts, favors, in exchange for approval. This was presented as remarkable. I had always considered it simply the job. I read for perhaps 20 minutes. Then I closed the magazine and set it on the workbench beside the blueberry muffin bag. The workshop was very quiet. Outside, the cardinal was back in the oak tree, running through its repertoire with the focused energy of a creature that had no idea it had an audience. I was still sitting there when Dot knocked on the workshop door at 11:30, carrying 2 mugs and a look on her face that suggested she had already decided something was wrong and was coming to shout out what. She pushed the door open and stopped when she saw the magazine on the workbench. She crossed the room, set the mugs down, and picked it up. She looked at the cover photograph for a long time without speaking, which for Dot was unusual enough to mean something. "That's you," she said. "Yes. 20 years ago, maybe. 21. She opened to the article, scanned the headline, looked at a few of the photographs inside. Her reading glasses were on a chain around her neck, and she put them on without seeming to notice she was doing it. The automatic gesture of a woman for whom reading glasses had long since become part of thinking. "Chief Inspector of the Commonwealth," she read aloud. Then she looked up at me over the rims of her glasses. "Arthur, you told me you worked in government administration." I did work in government administration. That is not what most people mean when they say government administration. "I know," I said. She set the magazine down carefully, the way you set something down when you are buying yourself time to arrange your thoughts. She picked up her coffee mug and wrapped both hands around it. Outside, the cardinal hit a particularly sharp note and then went quiet, as if it too was waiting to hear what came next. "Does Julian know?" she asked. The question landed with the particular weight of something obvious that nonetheless needed to be said out loud before it could be fully understood by everyone in the room. "No," I said. "Does anyone in his life know? Thomas knows. A few people I worked with. Nobody current." I picked up my own mug. When I retired, I retired. I didn't see the point in carrying the title around like a name tag. Dot looked at me with the expression she used when she thought I was being deliberately obtuse. "The point," she said, "is that your son thinks you are a retired carpenter." "I am a retired carpenter, among other things. Arthur." Dot. She made a sound that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh, the sound of a woman who has known someone long enough to understand that certain arguments are not worth the energy they require. She picked up the magazine again and looked at the cover photograph once more, and something shifted in her expression, softer this time, something that might have been sadness. "You never wanted him to respect you because of a title," she said. Not a question. "No," I said. "I wanted him to respect me because I was his father. That turned out to be the harder thing to earn." She put the magazine down and didn't say anything after that, which was the right response. There are things that don't benefit from being elaborated on, and Dot had always known the difference. We drank our coffee. The cardinal came back to the oak tree and started up again, indifferent and bright. I was still sitting there at 12:45 when my phone buzzed against the workbench. An unknown number, Richmond area code. I let it ring through to voicemail. 3 minutes later, it rang again, same number. Then a third time. Then a number I recognized, Julian's cell. I set the phone face down on the workbench. Dot watched me do it. She didn't ask who was calling. She looked at the face-down phone, and then at me, and her jaw tightened very slightly in the way it did when she was holding back something she had decided not to say. "I'm going to make lunch," she said instead, standing up. "You're going to eat it." "All right," I said. She picked up the empty mugs and walked to the door. Before she stepped out, she paused with her hand on the frame and looked back at me, at the magazine on the workbench, at the phone lying face down beside it, at the white oak cradle in the corner, catching the afternoon light. "Whoever is calling," she said quietly, "I don't think they're calling to apologize." She went out, and the door swung gently shut behind her. I sat alone in the workshop, the magazine open to my younger face, the phone buzzing again against the wood. I did not reach for it. Whatever was on the other end of that call, it could wait until I was ready. And I was not ready yet. I did not answer the phone that afternoon. By 2 o'clock, Julian had called 7 times. The unknown Richmond number, which I later learned belonged to Richard Sterling's personal assistant, had called 4 more. I sat in the workshop and let every one of them ring through to voicemail, and after the 7th call from Julian, I turned the phone over and watched the screen light up and go dark and light up again, and felt with a clarity that surprised me absolutely nothing. Not anger, not satisfaction, just a kind of settled stillness, the way a room feels after a long argument has finally ended and everyone has gone home. At 3:15, I went inside and made a sandwich and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the window at the empty road. Then I went back to the workshop and picked up the Charlottesville side table where I had left it the night before. Cherrywood. Close-grained. I worked until the light changed. It was Dot who eventually told me what had happened on the other end of those calls. She came over Sunday morning with coffee, and the particular expression she wore when she had information she had been sitting on overnight and could no longer reasonably contain. She had spoken to her nephew David, who worked in commercial real estate in Richmond, and knew people who knew people, which in a city the size of Richmond meant he knew most things within 24 hours of their occurring. The sequence of events, as Dot related, and as I later pieced together from other sources, was this. Richard Sterling had been sitting in the waiting area of a downtown law firm on Saturday morning, reviewing documents before a meeting, when he picked up the magazine from the coffee table the way people pick up magazines in waiting rooms, without intention, just to have something in his hands. He had opened it to the cover story, because the cover photograph had caught his eye the way photographs of men in good suits at government ceremonies tend to catch the eye of men who understand what such ceremonies mean. He had read the headline. He had looked at the photograph more carefully, and then, according to his assistant, he had stood up abruptly, excused himself from the waiting area, walked out to the corridor, and called Julian. Julian, by his own later account, had laughed. "Dad, it's probably just someone who looks like him," he had said, or something close to it. "My father is a woodworker in Millbrook. He makes furniture." Richard had not laughed. Richard had gone back to his office, handed the magazine to his assistant, a young man named Robert Haynes, 38, efficient, careful, and told him to find out whether the man on the cover was or was not Arthur Miller of Millbrook, Virginia, and to have an answer by end of business. Robert Haynes, from what I came to understand of him, was the kind of person who did exactly what he was asked to do, and did it well, and did not embellish the results. He had spent Saturday afternoon making calls to the Virginia Department of General Services, to the State Archives Office, to two former colleagues of mine, whose names appeared in the article. By 5 o'clock, he had a confirmation the man on the cover of the magazine was Arthur James Miller, formerly Chief Inspector of the Commonwealth of Virginia, retired 2019, currently residing in Millbrook. He had walked into Richard Sterling's office and placed a printed copy of my official state personnel file photograph on the desk beside the magazine. Same face. 40 years apart, but the same face. I learned later that Richard had looked at the two photographs for a long time without speaking. Then he had looked up at Robert and said with the controlled fury of a man who preferred to keep his composure in front of staff, "Get Julian on the phone." What happened next, I did not witness. But Julian told me about it weeks later in pieces, the way people tell you things they are ashamed of, in fragments, without looking directly at you, filling in the worst parts last. Richard had met him in the Sterling Group conference room. He had placed the magazine on the table. He had placed the personnel photograph beside it. And then when Julian had still tried to insist it must be a coincidence, Richard had done something that Julian described in a single sentence that told me everything I needed to know about the household my son had married into. He had struck Julian across the face with his open hand. Not hard enough to leave a mark, Julian said, as though the calibration of it somehow mattered. Just hard enough to stop the words. "You have been telling my daughter," Richard had said in the silence that followed, "that your father is a retired woodworker with no connections and no relevance. You have been telling her that for 2 years. You have let her believe it. You have let me believe it." Julian had not answered. "Do you understand?" Richard had continued, his voice dropping to the register, "that powerful men use when they want to make certain they are heard. What this man's former colleagues currently control, the Infrastructure Review Board, the Commercial Permitting Office, the State Construction Arbitration Panel." A pause. "Every office that is currently reviewing our downtown expansion project for potential code violations. The Downtown Expansion Project, a $47 million mixed-use development on the north side of Richmond, had been under review for 11 months. Sterling Group's legal team had been quietly managing a series of structural and environmental compliance questions that had the potential, if not resolved, to result in the project's suspension. Julian had understood then what he had not understood before, which was that his father-in-law was not calling him into a conference room to discuss family dynamics. He was calling him in because the man Julian had spent 2 years dismissing as a furniture maker in a small town had just become overnight the most important person in Richard Sterling's professional universe. And I had not been answering my phone. I listened to Dot tell me all of this on Sunday morning, sitting on the stool by the workbench, my coffee going cold in my hands. When she finished, the workshop was very quiet. "How do you feel?" she asked. I thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "Tired," I said. "Mostly just tired." She nodded as though that was exactly the right answer. Outside, the cardinal had not yet arrived for its morning performance. The oak tree stood empty against the pale sky, all its branches bare and patient, waiting for whatever came next. My phone buzzed against the workbench. I looked at the screen. Julian. Again. This time I picked it up. Julian's voice, when he answered, had the texture of a man who had not slept. "Dad." The word came out rough and unguarded, in a way I had not heard from him in years, not since he was maybe 22, 23, calling from Charlottesville after a bad exam before he had learned to sand down his edges before speaking to me. "Dad, I need to talk to you." "You're talking to me," I said. A long exhale. "I know you're angry." "I'm not angry, Julian." "Then what are you?" I thought about Dot's question from 20 minutes earlier and gave him the same honest answer. "Tired," I said. "Talk." He talked for 11 minutes. I know the length because I watched the call timer on the phone screen while he spoke, not out of impatience, but because I had learned long ago that tracking small concrete details helped me stay focused when the larger thing happening was difficult to absorb cleanly. He told me about the conference room. He told me about Richard's face when Robert laid the photographs side by side on the table. He did not tell me about the open-handed strike that came later in pieces, but he told me enough that I could feel the shape of what had happened in that room, the way you can feel the shape of furniture in the dark without being able to see it. "Dad," he said finally, when the 11 minutes had run their course, and he had told me everything he was ready to tell me. "Richard wants to meet you." "I imagine he does," I said. "He's going to send someone to the workshop this afternoon. Just to introduce the idea. No pressure." He paused. "His assistant, Robert." "I know who Robert is," I said, though this was not precisely true. I knew of Robert Haynes the way you know of anyone who has been described to you thoroughly enough that they no longer feel entirely like a stranger. Another pause longer this time. "Dad, I'm sorry about the text message. About the party." I let the apology sit in the air for a moment without picking it up. There are apologies that come from genuine remorse and apologies that come from changed circumstances, and it requires a certain discipline to receive both kinds with the same measured response, because the discipline is not for the other person, it is for yourself. "I'll talk to Richard's man when he comes," I said. "That's all I'm agreeing to," Julian said. "Thank you, Dad," with such visible relief that I could hear it through the phone, and we ended the call. Robert Haynes arrived at 2:30 that afternoon in a dark blue sedan, dressed in a charcoal blazer and tan chinos, carrying nothing. No briefcase, no folder, nothing that suggested an agenda, which told me the agenda was the point, and the emptiness was strategic. He was perhaps 38, with the careful, unhurried manner of someone who had learned early that the most effective way to move through a room was to give the impression of having nowhere urgent to be. I met him at the workshop door and shook his hand and offered him coffee, which he accepted. He looked around the workshop the way Thomas had looked around it that morning, slowly taking inventory, but where Thomas had been reassuring himself that things were in their right place, Robert was doing something different. He was reading the room the way a professional reads rooms, cataloging, assessing, looking for the information that a space gives up about its inhabitant when the inhabitant isn't paying attention. I let him look. I had nothing to hide in the workshop. Everything in it was exactly what it appeared to be. We sat on the stools by the workbench. He drank his coffee and I drank mine, and for the first 30 seconds neither of us said anything, which is the oldest negotiating posture in the world, and one I had encountered several hundred times in government conference rooms over 27 years. "Mr. Sterling sends his regards," Robert said finally. "That's kind of him," I said. "He'd like the opportunity to speak with you directly, at your convenience." He said it carefully, the phrase "your convenience" doing a lot of work, acknowledging that the power dynamic had shifted without explicitly naming the shift, which I thought showed a certain skill. "What does he want to speak about?" I asked, though I already knew. "The downtown expansion project," Robert said, "and the review process." He paused. "He believes there may have been some misunderstandings in the review. He'd like to discuss them with someone who understands the system." I picked up the cherry wood side table leg I had been shaping before the calls started and turned it over in my hands, running my thumb along the grain. The cherry was coming along well. Another week, maybe less. "I'm retired," I said. "Yes, sir." Robert nodded. "He's aware of that." I set the table leg down. I looked at Robert Haynes directly the way I had learned to look at people in 30 years of inspections, which is to say without hostility and without evasion, just clearly and completely long enough that they understand you are seeing them and not just the surface they are presenting. He held the look steadily, which told me something about him. Most people, when looked at that way, found something nearby to study. Robert didn't. He just looked back. "Tell me something," I said. "Not about the project. About yourself." He blinked once, the smallest recalibration. "What would you like to know? How long have you worked for Richard Sterling?" 8 years. "And before that, construction management. Small firm in Roanoke." A slight pause. "We lost a contract when I was 26. Compliance issue. I was the one who signed the submission." I looked at him. Was the submission accurate? He held my gaze. "No," he said. "It wasn't. I knew it wasn't when I signed it. I've known it every day since." The workshop was very quiet. Outside, a car passed on the road, slowed, continued on. I stood up and walked to the far corner of the workshop, where the white oak cradle sat against the wall. I laid one hand on the curved rail and looked at it for a moment, then looked back at Robert. "Tell Mr. Sterling I'll think about it," I said. Robert set his coffee mug down carefully on the workbench. He looked at the cradle, then at me. Something shifted in his expression, not pity, not sympathy exactly. Recognition, maybe. "That's a beautiful piece of work," he said quietly. "I know," I said. He walked to the door. Before he stepped out, he paused with his hand on the frame, the same spot where Dot always paused, I noticed, as if the door frame itself invited a final word. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "I don't think Mr. Sterling is calling about the project." He left before I could ask what he meant. His sedan pulled away from the curb, and the workshop went quiet again, the afternoon light moving slowly across the cherry wood. On the bench, warm and unhurried, indifferent to everything that had just happened in the room. Robert's sedan had been gone for perhaps 40 minutes when I heard a car pull up outside. I knew it was Julian before I looked up. There are sounds a parent learns to recognize over 38 years, the particular way a specific person closes a car door, the specific rhythm of a specific set of footsteps on gravel. And even now, even after everything my body knew my son's approach, before my mind had time to form an opinion about it. He knocked twice and opened the door without waiting, which he had always done as a boy and apparently still did when he was frightened enough to forget he was no longer a boy. He looked worse than he had sounded on the phone that morning. His collar was open, his jacket creased in the way jackets crease when they have been put on in a hurry, and worn through a long, difficult day without being taken off. His eyes were red at the rims, not from crying, I thought, but from the particular strain of a man who had spent several hours trying to hold himself together in front of people he needed to impress, and had found the effort more costly than he had anticipated. He stood in the doorway of the workshop and looked at me across the workbench, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then Julian crossed the workshop floor, and he went down onto both knees on the concrete in front of me. I had not expected that. Even knowing what I knew about the situation, even having heard from Robert what the stakes were for the Sterling Group, I had not expected my 38-year-old son to kneel on the floor of my workshop, the way he had knelt as a child when he dropped something breakable and was trying to minimize the damage before I noticed. The gesture was so raw and so unguarded that it took me a moment to process it, and in that moment something moved through my chest that I did not entirely welcome. Not softness exactly, but the memory of softness, the ghost of a feeling I had spent several weeks carefully setting aside. Dad. His voice broke on the word in a way that had nothing practiced about it. Dad, I'm sorry. I am so sorry. I set down the cabinet scraper I had been holding. I looked at my son on his knees on the concrete floor, his hands pressed flat against his thighs, the way hands press when they are trying to keep from shaking. Get up, Julian, I said. I need you to hear me first. I'm hearing you. Get up. He got up slowly, the way a man gets up when his knees hurt, and his pride hurts more. He stood in front of me with his hands at his sides, and he talked. He talked for a long time, longer than the 11 minutes on the phone that morning. Longer and less organized, the words coming out, in the disordered way that words come when they have been building pressure behind a door that has finally given way. He talked about Cassandra, about the first year of their marriage, when Richard had made it quietly, persistently clear that Julian's position in the family depended on his ability to present himself as a man of standing, a man with the right background, the right connections, the right kind of family. He talked about the shame he had felt, his word shame, every time someone in Cassandra's circle had asked what his father did, and he had said, woodworker, and watched their faces do the small, polite recalibration that faces do when the answer is not what was hoped for. I told myself it didn't matter what I said. Julian told me, his voice unsteady. I told myself you wouldn't care, that you never cared what people thought, that it wasn't hurting you 'cause you didn't know. I know, I said. He flinched. I know you know. I'm telling you why I did it anyway. I'm not asking you to excuse it. I need you to understand that I am not the person I have been acting like. I need you to know that. That boy was still in there. I could see him. I just was not sure anymore whether that was enough. Julian, I said, why are you here? He blinked. To apologize. Are you here to apologize, or are you here because Robert went back to Richard and told him I said I would think about it, and Richard sent you because he believes a son on his knees will accomplish what a professional envoy could not? The question landed in the room like a stone landing in still water. Julian's jaw tightened. For a moment I thought he was going to argue, to deny it, to give me the version of this that made him look better than the question suggested. He had always been good at that, at finding the angle that let him be the sympathetic figure in his own story. He didn't do that. He looked at the workshop floor instead, at the concrete between us, and he said, both. It's both things. I came because I am genuinely sorry, and I came because the situation is what it is, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. Not to you. That was the most honest thing my son had said to me in 2 years, maybe longer. I was quiet for a moment, turning what he had said over the way I turned wood over before cutting it, looking at the grain, looking for weaknesses, looking for the places where it might split under pressure. "I'll come to the party," I said. Julian exhaled so sharply it was almost a sound. "Dad, I'll come to Leo's celebration." I held up one hand to stop whatever was coming next. "But I am coming for Leo, not for Richard, not for the downtown expansion project, not for you. Do you understand the difference?" Julian nodded fast and emphatic, the nodding of a man who would have agreed to almost anything in that moment. "There's one more thing," I said. He waited. "I'm coming as myself. I'm not going to perform anything for Richard Sterling's benefit. I'm not going to make phone calls or pull strings or have conversations that serve his interests. I will walk in the door, I will give Leo his gift, and I will conduct myself the way I have always conducted myself. That is all I am agreeing to." Julian said, "I understand." And his voice had gone quiet in a different way now. Not the quietness of relief, but the quietness of a man who has just heard something true about himself and is not yet sure what to do with it. "Go home," I said. "Get some sleep. You look terrible." He almost smiled at that. Almost. He walked to the door, and this time he did not pause at the frame the way Robert had, the way Dot always did. He walked straight through and out into the late afternoon, and I heard his car door close his particular way of closing it, and the engine start, and the tires on the gravel going quiet as he reached the road. I stood alone in the workshop. On the workbench, the cherrywood side table leg sat waiting where I had left it. On the far wall, the white oak cradle held its place in the corner. Through the window, the light had gone the color of old brass, the particular gold of a Virginia afternoon in late March, when the season has finally made up its mind. I picked up the cabinet scraper and went back to work. I wore the gray suit. It was the same suit I had worn to the signing ceremony in 2004, the one in the photograph on the magazine cover, because it was the only suit I owned that was worth wearing to an event of this kind, and because I saw no reason to pretend otherwise. I had taken it to the dry cleaner in town on Tuesday, and it had come back on Thursday in a plastic sleeve smelling of something chemical and clean. I hung it on the back of the workshop door for 2 days, the way I always hung good clothes in the workshop, so the wood smell would work its way into the fabric and soften whatever the dry cleaner had done to it. Dot watched me load the hatchback from her front porch, arms crossed against the evening chill. "You look respectable," she called across the yard. "I'm always respectable," I said. "You look it tonight is what I mean." She paused. "The suit is good." I drove the 40 minutes to the Sterling estate on the eastern edge of Henrico County, with the radio off and both hands on the wheel. The estate sat back from the road behind a low stone wall and an iron gate that stood open for the evening, with a uniformed attendant waving cars through onto the gravel drive. I parked where the attendant directed me in a field that had been converted for the occasion into an overflow lot, and I carried the hatchback's cargo, the white oak cradle wrapped again in its moving blanket, up the long gravel path toward the main house. Other guests moved around me. On the path, couples in evening wear, a few men in suits, the particular social energy of a gathering where everyone has dressed to signal something. I walked among them with the cradle under my arm and received a few curious glances that I did not acknowledge, because I had spent 27 years walking into rooms where I was not expected and had learned long ago that the most effective response to curiosity was simply to continue moving. The main entrance was a wide portico with 4 stone columns and a pair of doors that had been propped open to allow the flow of arriving guests. I had been to larger houses, government buildings, state facilities, the sort of institutional architecture that exists to communicate permanence. But the Sterling estate was the particular kind of large that was designed to communicate something more personal than permanence. It was designed to communicate arrival. The arrival of a family that had decided at some point in its history that it had earned the right to live on this scale. I stepped under the portico and stopped. Richard Sterling was standing just inside the entrance to the right of the open doors, with Cassandra on his left, and Julian hovering 2 steps behind her, with the expression of a man who has rehearsed this moment several times and is discovering that rehearsal was insufficient preparation. Richard saw me before I reached the door. I watched him make the decision. I could see it happen, the small but deliberate gathering of himself, the straightening that was less physical than intentional. And then he stepped forward out from under the portico and onto the top step and extended his hand. "Mr. Miller," he said. His voice was controlled and even, and carried the particular weight of a man who had spent 60 years ensuring that his voice always sounded that way. "Richard Sterling, I'm glad you came." I shifted the cradle to my left arm and shook his hand. His grip was firm and dry, the handshake of a man who had given and received thousands of handshakes and understood their grammar precisely. "Thank you for the invitation," I said. Something moved behind his eyes at that, a flicker of something that might have been appreciation for the precision of my response, which did not acknowledge that the invitation had arrived only after considerable drama and a week's worth of unreturned phone calls. He stepped aside and gestured toward the interior. "Please," he said. "Leo is looking forward to meeting his grandfather properly." Cassandra said, "Arthur, it's so good to see you," with a warmth that was not entirely performed, which surprised me. She kissed my cheek in the way that people do at events when the gesture is more cultural than personal, and I thanked her, and then I was inside. The entrance hall was marble-floored and high-ceilinged, with flowers arranged on pedestals in the way that flowers are arranged when someone has been paid to arrange them, rather than someone who loved them has put them there. To the left, through a wide archway, the main reception room was already full, perhaps 80 people. The soft roar of gathered conversation, the clink of glasses, a string quartet working through something I recognized but could not name. Julian appeared at my elbow. "Dad." His voice was low and tight. "I'll take you to a table." "I know how to find a table," I said pleasantly. "Go be with your wife." He hesitated, then went, which was the right decision. I moved into the room slowly, the cradle against my side, and took stock of what was around me. I recognized 3 faces from my years in government: a former city planning commissioner, a man who had once sat on the state infrastructure board, and near the far window, standing with a drink and looking slightly uncomfortable in his evening jacket, Thomas Briggs, who caught my eye across the room and gave me the small nod that 40 years of friendship had compressed into a single movement. And then, at a table in the far left corner, almost directly beneath the string quartet's line of sight, a man I had not expected to see. Heavy-set mid-50s in a dark suit that fit well enough, but had been bought a size too large across the shoulders, the way men buy suits when they have lost weight they are not sure they will keep off. He was looking down at his phone when I first saw him, but as I watched, he looked up and our eyes met across the width of the room. Marcus Webb, the man whose project I had shut down in 2012. The man who had, in a conference room, not entirely unlike the rooms in this building, told me that I was a bureaucratic instrument of professional destruction, and that he would ensure I regretted the decision. He looked at me. I looked at him. I gave him the same small nod I had given Thomas. Then I looked away because there were other things to attend to, and the conversation that would happen between Marcus Webb and me tonight, if it happened at all, would happen in its own time. Near the center of the room, Cassandra was bringing Leo through a cluster of guests, the baby in a white outfit held against her shoulder, his dark eyes moving over the room with the unimpressed equanimity of someone encountering a large party for the first time and finding it neither more nor less than expected. I watched my grandson from across the room. He was 8 weeks old, and he was looking at the string quartet with the focused intensity of a person who had recently discovered that sound existed and was still deciding what to make of it. I tightened my grip on the moving blanket and waited for my moment. I spent the first 40 minutes at the party the way I had spent most large gatherings over the course of my career, near the edges, watching. It was not shyness. I want to be clear about that, because there is a version of this story where the old woodworker stands alone at the party, feeling out of place, and that is not the story I am telling. I had attended dozens of events like this: one government receptions, industry dinners, legislative ceremonies, where the point was less the occasion than the network being maintained around it, and I had learned long ago that the edges of a room were where the useful observations happened. The center was for performance. The edges were for understanding. What I understood watching from near the window where Thomas had positioned himself with a glass of sparkling water and the expression of a man enduring an obligation cheerfully was that the Sterling party was being run with a precision that had very little to do with celebrating a baby and quite a lot to do with demonstrating something. The flower arrangements were too considered, the string quartet too well chosen. The guest list, from what I could see of it, was less a collection of people who loved Julian and Cassandra than a carefully assembled argument for the family's position in Richmond society. Thomas drifted over at some point and stood beside me. "Nice flowers," he said. "Very nice," I agreed. I counted 4 city council members, 2 state delegates, and a federal magistrate. "I counted 5 council members," I said. Thomas raised his glass slightly. "I stand corrected." He looked at the cradle under my arm. "When are you going up?" "When the moment is right." He nodded and drifted away again, which was the correct thing to do. Thomas had always understood the difference between company and presence. Sometimes what a person needed was not conversation, but simply for another person to occupy the same room. I found Cassandra 20 minutes later near the far end of the reception area, in a momentary gap between social obligations, Leo still against her shoulder. She saw me coming and shifted the baby slightly, and I understood this as an invitation. "May I?" I asked and held out my hands. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second, the hesitation of a woman who had spent Leo's entire short life managing, who held him and when and in what context, and then she placed him in my arms. Leo was heavier than I expected. Children always are, you forget, between babies, that they have the specific solid weight of something that is building itself from the inside, adding density by the hour. He wore a white cotton outfit with small blue stitching at the collar, and he smelled of the particular clean sweetness that newborns carry before the world has had time to leave any other marks on them. He looked up at my face. I looked down at his. He had my eyes, my mother's eyes, dark and wide-set, the kind of eyes that look at things directly without apology. And in the moment I registered this, I felt something move through me that I had not felt in a long time, and could not have named precisely if I had tried. Not joy, though there was joy in it. Not grief, though there was grief in it too. Something that contained both of those things, and something older than either of them. "Hello, Leo," I said quietly. Leo made no sound. He continued looking at my face with the focused, evaluating expression of someone who was gathering data about a new thing and had not yet reached a conclusion. I found this entirely reasonable. I had spent 27 years gathering data before reaching conclusions and considered it the correct approach. I held him for perhaps 3 minutes. Then Cassandra was back at my elbow gently, the way mothers return to their children at parties, not because anything is wrong, but because 3 minutes is simply the unit of time after which the need to have your child back in your arms becomes stronger than social courtesy. I gave Leo back. Cassandra looked at me over his head with an expression I had not seen from her before, something careful and a little uncertain, like a person who has just recalculated something and is not yet sure what the new number means. "He does like you," she said, which was more than I had expected her to say. "He doesn't know me yet," I said, "but I intend to fix that." She nodded slowly, and I moved away. The program began at 8:30. A woman with a microphone welcomed the guests, said several things about Leo that were charming and accurate, in the way that professional remarks about babies always are, and then announced that the family had arranged a brief gift presentation before dinner. Julian found me in the crowd. His hand came to my elbow, not steering, just locating. "Dad, you can present from the table if you'd rather. You don't have to go up." I looked at him. "I know I don't have to." "I just meant Julian." I said his name in the way that stops a sentence. "Go stand with your wife." He went. I waited until 3 other gifts had been presented: an elaborate silver rattle from someone's aunt, a framed print of Leo's birth announcement, designed by a calligrapher, a stuffed bear the size of a small child, and then I picked up the cradle in both arms and walked toward the low platform at the front of the room. The platform was perhaps 8 inches high enough to be seen from the back of the room, with a microphone stand and a small table where the other gifts had been placed. I stepped up without using the microphone. My voice had always carried a fact that had served me well in inspections and public hearings, and would serve me now. "My name is Arthur Miller," I said. "I am Leo's grandfather." The room quieted, the way rooms quiet when someone speaks without amplification, in a setting where amplification is expected. People turned. Julian, near the far wall, had gone very still. Richard Sterling, I noticed, was watching from a position near the center of the room, with the careful, assessing look of a man who has released control of a situation and is monitoring what happens next. I set the cradle on the table. I pulled the moving blanket away from it, and the white oak and pine caught the chandelier light, the way good wood catches light, not shining, but glowing, something lit from within rather than from without. "I made this for my grandson," I said. "White oak frame, pine body, hand-cut joinery. It will outlast every other piece of furniture in this room." I paused. "I came here tonight to give Leo this cradle. That is the only reason I am standing here." I stepped down from the platform. The room was very quiet, not the uncomfortable quiet of a moment gone wrong, but the particular quiet of a room that has just encountered something it was not prepared for and needs a moment to absorb it. Then, in the far left corner beneath the string quartet's position, Marcus Webb set down his drink and stood up. The guests nearest him glanced over. A few people shifted to see. Marcus was not a small man, and he was not moving hesitantly. He was moving with the deliberate, unhurried purpose of someone who has decided to do something difficult and has decided to do it properly. He walked across the room toward me, and the crowd parted for him, in the instinctive way crowds part for people who are moving with that kind of intention. He stopped 3 feet in front of me. My heart did not accelerate. My hands did not move. I looked at Marcus Webb across those 3 feet and waited for whatever was coming, the way I had always waited for whatever was coming, with my feet flat on the floor and my eyes open, and no particular plan beyond staying exactly where I was. Marcus Webb had the kind of face that had once been open and was now careful, the face of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that openness was a liability he could not afford. He was 52, maybe 53, with the broad shoulders of someone who had spent his younger years doing physical work before moving into the offices that managed it. And his dark suit, a size too large across those shoulders, gave him the look of a man who had recently shed something he had been carrying for a long time. He stood in front of me for a moment, without speaking, and the room around us had gone quiet, in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something real is happening in the middle of a great deal of performance. "Mr. Miller," he said. His voice was steady but effortful, the steadiness of a man gripping something tightly enough that his hand did not shake. "Marcus," I said. He blinked at the use of his first name, a small recalibration. Then he pressed forward. "You shut down my project in 2012, he said. "The North Side warehouse conversion on Chamberlain Avenue. You came to the site, you reviewed the structural submissions, and you issued a stop work order the following Tuesday." He paused. "I lost $400,000 in sunk costs and the better part of a year's contracts. I stood in my office and I told my project manager that Arthur Miller was the most destructive bureaucrat I had ever encountered in 20 years of construction." The room was very still. Near the far wall, I was aware of Julian's presence without looking at him, the particular stillness of a person who has stopped breathing in order to hear something more clearly. "I remember the project," I said. "The load-bearing calculations in the third-floor submission were based on the original warehouse framing from 1961. The framing had been partially replaced in 1988 with materials that did not match the load rating of the originals. The submission did not account for that discrepancy." Marcus nodded once slowly. "I know," he said. "I knew at the time. I thought it was close enough." He stopped. "I want to tell you what happened 3 years later." "All right," I said. The building next door, same block, same era, same construction type, had been converted by a different developer. Different inspectors signed off. In July of 2015, the northeast corner of the third floor gave way during a tenant's moving day. He paused and something moved across his face that was not quite composure, and not quite its absence, but something suspended between the two. 4 people were in the stairwell. A woman named Patricia Stokes, her husband Gerald, their son, he was 19, and a college friend of the son's helping with the move. Gerald Stokes and the friend didn't make it out. The string quartet had stopped playing. I did not know when exactly, but the music was gone and the room was quiet enough that I could hear the chandelier crystals shifting faintly in the air current from the open doors. "The building that killed Gerald Stokes," Marcus said, "had the same structural discrepancy mine had. Same era, same partial replacement, same unaccounted load differential. The inspector who approved it retired 2 years before the collapse." He looked at me directly, and his jaw was working in the way jaws work when a man is holding something in place by main effort. "You shut me down because the numbers were wrong. I spent 3 years hating you for it. Then I spent the next 6 understanding that you saved my family from being the ones responsible for those stairs." His voice cracked on the last word. Not dramatically, just the small, structural failure of a man who has said a hard thing out loud for the first time in a room full of people and has not entirely prepared for what that costs. "I have a daughter," Marcus said. "She's 24 now. She started at my firm last year." He stopped, steadied. "I would like her to be able to look at the buildings her father built and not see what I almost built." He extended his hand. "I've owed you this for 11 years. I'm sorry it took me this long to find the right room to say it in." I shook his hand. I held it for a moment longer than a handshake strictly requires, because some things need more time than courtesy allocates, and Marcus Webb had just given me something that I had not known I needed and could not have asked for. "You didn't owe me anything," I said. "You owed it to the numbers. I just happened to be the one reading them." He nodded, and something in his face released not all the way, not the complete loosening of a burden set down, but the particular easing of a man who has done the thing he came to do and can now breathe at a normal depth again. He returned to his table. The room held its quiet for another moment, the way rooms hold a breath after something has been said that changes the air. And then the conversation resumed around me in a different key, lower, more thoughtful. The social register of people who have just witnessed something they had not expected and are not quite sure where to put it. Julian was staring at me from across the room. His mouth was slightly open. He looked like a man who had just watched someone he thought he knew walk into a room he had not known existed. I let him stare. I turned and accepted a glass of water from a passing server and drank half of it and looked at the white oak cradle on the presentation table where it sat among the silver rattles and calligrapher prints and oversized stuffed bears with the particular authority of something that did not need company to know what it was. Richard Sterling appeared at my left shoulder. He did it smoothly, the practiced materializing of a man who had spent 60 years learning to enter conversations without appearing to have entered them. He had a glass of something amber in his right hand and a cream-colored envelope in his left, and he set the envelope on the table beside me with the casual gesture of someone setting down a coaster. "Remarkable man, Webb," Richard said, as though we had been in the middle of a conversation. "Known him for years. Good contractor when he's managed properly." I looked at the envelope. It was thick, the thickness of a document rather than a letter, the specific density of paper folded around other paper. "Inside," Richard said, keeping his voice at the register of private conversation, "you'll find a letter of appreciation and a certified check, a contribution to whatever cause or institution you prefer. No strings, no expectations." He lifted his glass slightly. "Call it gratitude from a family that got off on the wrong foot." I picked up the envelope. I turned it over once in my hands, feeling its weight, feeling the contents shift slightly inside. Then I set it back on the table and pushed it gently but completely back toward Richard. "I don't take envelopes," I said. "I never have. That's not a position that's changed." Richard's jaw tightened, a single contraction quickly controlled. "Arthur, Mr. Sterling." I said it without hostility, which was important. Hostility would have given him something to push against. "I came to this party to give my grandson a cradle. That is the entirety of what I came to do. If your family would like a different relationship with me going forward, I am open to that conversation. But it will not begin with an envelope." He looked at me for a long moment. Richard Sterling was not a man who was looked at the way I was looking at him, directly, without deference, without the small social accommodations that wealth and position had trained most people to make automatically in his presence. I watched him recalibrate the internal adjustment of a man encountering resistance in a place he had not expected to find it. He picked up the envelope. He put it in his inside jacket pocket. He took a drink from his glass. "Fair enough," he said finally, which I thought was probably the most honest thing Richard Sterling had said to anyone in quite some time. He moved away into the crowd, and I watched him go, and then I turned back to the room and to the cradle on the table and to the particular work of the next hour, whatever it turned out to be. Across the room, Julian had closed his mouth. He was watching me with an expression I did not have a name for, not pride, not shame, something between the two that had not yet decided which direction it was falling. I picked up my water glass and waited. Before I reveal how I looked my son in the eye and laid down the ultimate truth. Comment, "Still here, so I know you're standing with me." And please note, the following chapter contains some dramatized elements that may not be entirely factual. If you prefer not to listen to a fictionalized account, feel free to turn off the video right now. Julian came to me 20 minutes after Richard walked away. I had been standing near the presentation table watching the room settle back into its social rhythms, the conversation resuming, the string quartet starting up again, with something quieter than before, the servers moving through the crowd with fresh glasses. The party had absorbed what had happened, the way parties absorb most things, by simply continuing by redistributing attention to the next available surface. But I could feel it underneath the altered texture of the room, the way certain conversations had become slightly more careful, and certain glances had become slightly more considered. Julian crossed the room with the particular stride of a man who has made a decision he is not entirely certain about, and is moving quickly so he does not have time to unmake it. He stopped in front of me, and his jaw was set, and his eyes were bright, in the way that eyes go bright when the emotion behind them has been held in check for too long and is beginning to press against its container. "Dad." His voice was low and tight. "I need to talk to you." "You've been talking to me all evening," I said. "Not like this." He glanced around, checking I understood whether anyone nearby was positioned to overhear. Finding the radius insufficient, he put his hand on my elbow and steered me 2 steps toward the window alcove away from the nearest cluster of guests. I allowed this because the alcove was where the conversation needed to happen anyway. He stood with his back to the room, which meant I was facing it, facing the chandelier light and the guests. And in the far distance, the presentation table where the white oak cradle sat among the other gifts. I could see Thomas from where I stood near the far wall, his glass still in hand, watching with the quiet attentiveness of a man who understood that what was about to happen was not his business and was therefore his responsibility to witness carefully. "What did you say to Richard?" Julian asked. "I told him I don't take envelopes." "Dad." The word came out compressed, all the air squeezed out of it. "Do you understand what that envelope represented? Do you understand what it would have meant for this family if you had just—" He stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "I'm not asking you to do anything corrupt. I'm asking you to make a phone call. One phone call to one person who used to work for you. Just to clarify the review timeline. That's all." "That's not all," I said. "You know that's not all. It's a conversation. Conversations happen every day between people who know each other. Not conversations about active compliance reviews," I said. "Not conversations that result in timelines being adjusted for the benefit of one party in that review. That is not a conversation. That is influence. I spent 27 years defining the line between those two things, and I am not going to blur it now because your father-in-law's project is in trouble." Julian's hands came up, a gesture of frustration, controlled, but visible, the specific movement of a man who wants to throw something and has decided instead to simply display the impulse. "You keep talking about 27 years like it's a shield," he said, his voice rising slightly before he pulled it back. "Like nobody can touch you because you have a perfect record. But Dad, I am drowning here. Do you understand that the project is frozen? Richard is furious. Cassandra hasn't slept in a week. And you are standing here at my son's party talking about compliance reviews like you're still behind your government desk." I looked at my son. I let his words finish settling the way you let paint settle before you look at it. Not to be cruel, but because the only honest response to a speech like that is one that comes after you have genuinely heard it, rather than one that arrives while it is still in the air. "Julian," I said, "how long have you been telling people your father makes furniture?" He blinked. The pivot caught him off guard. "What?" "Richard's guests, Cassandra's friends. The people in this room who asked about your family and were told your father was a retired woodworker." I kept my voice level. "How long?" His jaw tightened. "That's not what this is about." "How long, Julian?" He looked at the floor. 2 years, he said. "Maybe a little more. 2 years." I repeated it not as an accusation, but as a fact that needed to occupy the space between us fully before anything else could. 2 years of telling people I was something smaller than I am, because what I actually was did not fit the story you were telling about yourself. I paused. I don't say this to wound you. I say it because if we are going to have an honest conversation, we need to start from an honest place. Julian's head came up. His eyes were bright and wet at the rims, now not from frustration, but from something rawer than frustration, something that had been sitting underneath the frustration all evening and had just found its way to the surface. His voice, when he spoke, had lost its tightness. What was left was something younger and more exposed. I know, he said. I know what I did. I've known the whole time. Then you know I can't make that phone call, I said. Not because of my record, because of yours. Because the moment I pick up that phone, I become the version of your father that you invented, the one you pull out when he's useful and put away when he's not. And I will not be that. Not for Richard Sterling, not for you, not for anyone. Julian opened his mouth, closed it. His throat moved. Dad, I have one more thing to say. I told him, and then I am going to find Thomas, and we are going to say goodnight to Leo together, and we are going to leave. So listen carefully, because I am only going to say it once. He listened. The night you sent me that text message, the one telling me not to come to my own grandson's celebration, because I would embarrass you. I sat in my workshop until 4 a.m. I did not call you. I did not drive to your house. I did not make a scene. I sent you a voicemail that said I understood, and I wished Leo a good day. I held his gaze without flinching, and without any particular heat, because what I was saying did not require heat. It required only accuracy. From the moment I sent that voicemail, I have not had a son named Julian. What I have had is a situation involving a person I used to know very well, and I have been managing that situation as carefully as I know how. The words landed. I watched them land, watched Julian's face do the thing that faces do when they receive something true and painful simultaneously, the slight collapse around the eyes, the jaw tightening and then releasing, the particular stillness of a person absorbing a blow they knew was coming, but had not known the exact shape of until it arrived. He did not argue. He did not deflect. He stood in the window alcove with the chandelier light catching the edges of his face, and he looked at me with an expression that was not anger, and was not self-pity, and was not the practiced social smoothness he had been wearing all evening. It was grief, plain and uncomplicated. The grief of a man who has just heard the exact cost of something he chose, stated without embellishment, by the person who paid it. I don't know how to fix this, he said finally. His voice was barely above a whisper. No, I agreed. You don't. Not tonight. I straightened my jacket. I looked across the room at Thomas, who met my eyes and set his glass down on the nearest surface with the quiet efficiency of a man who has been waiting for exactly this signal. Good night, Julian, I said. I walked away from my son and across the width of the room, past the string quartet and the flower arrangements, and the 80 guests who had come to celebrate a baby and witnessed something else entirely. And I did not look back. Thomas fell into step beside me as I reached the presentation table. I stopped long enough to lay one hand on the white oak cradle, the curved rail smooth and solid under my palm, and then I picked up the moving blanket from beneath the table and tucked it under my arm. Ready? Thomas said. Yes, I said. We walked out together through the wide entrance hall, past the marble floors and the pedestal flowers, and out through the propped open doors into the cool March night. And the sound of the party faded behind us as we crossed the portico and started down the long gravel path toward the parking field. Above us, the Virginia sky was clear and very dark, with the particular density of a sky that has no city light close enough to soften it, and the stars were out, in the way that stars are out in the country, not decorative, not atmospheric, just present, enormous and indifferent, and entirely without opinion about anything that had just happened inside that house. I breathed the cold air and kept walking. 3 days after the party, Thomas called me at 7 in the morning while I was on my second cup of coffee and my first hour of work on a rocking chair, commissioned by a retired school teacher in Staunton. "It's done," he said. I set down my coffee. "Walk me through it." "The department issued the formal stop work order yesterday afternoon. I signed it myself. He paused. "The documentation your former colleagues provided was thorough. The structural deficiencies in the North Side expansion go back further than the current submission. There are compliance gaps in the foundation work from the original permit, 2018. It was always going to come apart. We just now have the complete picture." Anyone push back? Richard Sterling's attorney called my office twice. I returned neither call. Another pause shorter. "Arthur, this was going to happen regardless of Saturday night. The file was complete before you walked into that party. You didn't cause this." "I know," I said. "Thank you, Thomas." We said goodbye, and I hung up and stood in the workshop for a moment, holding the phone. Outside, Dot's kitchen light was on across the yard, a small yellow square in the early morning gray. I thought about calling her. Instead, I went back to the rocking chair, picked up my spokeshalve, and went back to work. The weeks that followed moved the way consequential things move, not dramatically, but with a kind of grinding inevitability, each development following from the last, the way joinery follows from good preparation. You do the work correctly at the beginning, and the pieces fit at the end, whether you are there to see it or not. Sterling Group's downtown expansion project was formally suspended in the second week of April. By May, 3 additional compliance issues had surfaced in 2 other Sterling properties currently under municipal review. Richard's attorneys filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, the reorganization option, not liquidation, which told me Richard still believed he could salvage something, but the filing triggered a cascade of creditor actions that made reorganization increasingly theoretical. Cassandra called me once in late April from a number I didn't recognize. She told me that she and Julian were separating. She said it the way people say things they have practiced saying evenly, without visible seams, but I could hear underneath it the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding a structure together, past the point where holding it made sense and has finally put it down. "I'm sorry." I told her, and meant it, because whatever Julian had done, and whatever her family had done, Cassandra was not a villain in this story. She was a woman who had married a man who wanted more than he was willing to earn honestly, and she had paid for that with something she would not get back. "Leo is with me," she said. "He's fine." "I know he's fine," I said. "He has you." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what comes next," she said finally. "Nobody does," I told her. "That's not a problem. That's just what next looks like before it happens." She said goodbye. I said goodbye. The line went quiet. Julian's situation resolved itself in the way that legal situations resolve themselves. When a man has signed documents he should not have signed and knew it when he signed them. His attorney negotiated a plea agreement. Julian cooperated with investigators, provided testimony regarding the specific submissions he had authorized, and in exchange received a reduced charge and a sentencing recommendation of 14 months in a minimum security facility in Chesterfield County, with eligibility for early release after 8. I learned the details from Thomas, who had followed the proceedings through professional channels. Julian did not call me. I did not call him. There was nothing to say that had not already been said in a window alcove at a party in Henrico County on a March Saturday night, and we both understood that. What I did the week after Julian's plea was entered was drive to Charlottesville. I went to the storage unit where Julian had kept boxes from his college apartment, the unit he had never cleaned out, that he had been paying $40 a month to maintain for 15 years, out of what I could only assume was the same reluctance that keeps most of us from finishing things. We started in our 20s. I had a key because Julian had given me one years ago for emergencies and never asked for it back. I found what I was looking for in the third box from the back, a wooden crate Julian had used as a bookshelf in his dorm room, rough pine, the boards uneven, held together with wood screws driven at angles that told me they had been driven by someone who had not yet learned to pre-drill. On the bottom of the crate, burned into the wood with what must have been a soldering iron borrowed from somewhere in the uneven lettering of a 19-year-old, who had decided the thing needed a mark of some kind, J. Miller, 2005. I carried it to the truck. I drove home. I set it on the workbench and looked at it for a long time. The crooked screws, the uneven boards, the burned initials. The same hands that had made this had made the pine box at 8 years old. The same hands that had signed the sterling submissions. Hands could make things, and hands could ruin things, and sometimes they did both in the same lifetime. And what you did with that knowledge was the only question that mattered. I set the crate on the shelf above the workbench, next to the spokes halve and the card scrapers, and went back to the rocking chair. The lawyer's name was Patricia Okafor, young, precise, with the careful manner of someone who had learned early that her job was to deliver difficult information clearly and then get out of the way of whatever the information produced. She arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, parked her gray Civic on the gravel, and knocked twice before I had the door fully open. She carried a single folder and nothing else. "Mr. Miller," she said, "I represent Cassandra Sterling Miller. She's asked me to discuss Leo's care arrangement." I made coffee. She sat on the stool by the workbench and explained the situation in the direct, organized way of someone who had rehearsed the explanation to make it as painless as possible without making it dishonest. Cassandra's financial situation had deteriorated significantly since Richard's Chapter 11 filing. Her personal assets had been partially encumbered by creditor actions connected to the Sterling Group collapse. She was restructuring, she was working. She was not without resources, but providing the level of stability that Leo needed while managing what she was managing had become, in her attorney's careful language, a coordination challenge she was not currently equipped to resolve alone. She wanted Arthur to take Leo, not permanently, not yet, not with that word, but under a temporary guardianship arrangement that Cassandra would voluntarily execute, transferring legal decision-making authority for Leo's day-to-day care to me while she stabilized her situation. Under Virginia law, a grandparent could petition for temporary guardianship when a parent voluntarily consented. The court would review the arrangement, assess the proposed guardian's fitness, and issue an order if satisfied. Patricia estimated 3 weeks from filing to approval, assuming no complications. "She chose you specifically," Patricia said over her coffee. "She said, and I am quoting her directly, that you were the only person in Leo's life she trusted to want nothing from him except for him to be fine." I sat with that for a moment. "Tell Cassandra yes," I said. Patricia filed the paperwork that afternoon. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in late October, a Henrico County family court judge reviewed the petition, the background documentation, and a brief statement I had submitted, describing my living situation, my financial position, and my intentions regarding Leo's care. The judge approved the arrangement in 11 minutes, which Patricia told me was unusually fast, and which I attributed to the fact that the paperwork was impeccable because Patricia was very good at her job. Leo came home on a Friday. Cassandra drove him herself. I had expected her to send someone, or to make the handoff brief and functional, the way difficult handoffs are often made with efficiency as a substitute for whatever emotion the situation actually contained. But she drove herself in a white SUV, I hadn't seen before, and she carried Leo to the door herself, and she stood on the threshold of the workshop, holding her 7-month-old son against her shoulder, with both arms wrapped around him, in the way that told me she had been holding him like that for the entire drive. "He likes being on the left side," she said. Her voice was steady. "He sleeps better on his left, and he doesn't like the sound of the vacuum cleaner. I don't know why. I've tried introducing it slowly, but he just—" She stopped, pressed her lips together, continued. "He'll tell you what he needs. He's gotten very good at that." "He sounds like someone I know," I said. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. She placed Leo in my arms. He was heavier than the last time I had held him. 7 months of building himself from the inside, adding density, the way good wood adds density slowly and without announcement. He looked at my face with the same focused, evaluating expression he had worn at the party, and then he reached out one small hand and grabbed my shirt collar and held on. Cassandra watched this. Her jaw tightened once hard and then released. "I'll call every day," she said. "I know you will," I said. "He'll be here." She stood there for one more moment, looking at her son in my arms. Then she turned and walked back to the white SUV and got in and drove away without looking back. Which I understood was not coldness, but its opposite, the particular courage of a woman doing the hardest thing she had ever done, and doing it as cleanly as she could manage. Dot appeared at the fence line 30 seconds later, which told me she had been watching from her kitchen window and had timed her arrival with the precision of someone who understood exactly how long a person needed to be alone after a moment like that. She came through the gate carrying a folded blanket and a small framed watercolor of a cardinal red, vivid the bird caught mid-call on a branch. "For his room," she said, nodding at the watercolor. "Children need color." "You've mentioned that," I said. She looked at Leo. Leo looked at her. Then he made a sound, not quite a word, not a word, and reached toward her the way he had reached toward me, which told me something about him that I filed away carefully. He did not withhold himself from people. He had not yet learned to. Dot took his hand in both of hers. She looked at his face for a long time. "He has your eyes," she said quietly. "Exactly your eyes." I looked down at my grandson. He was still holding my collar with one hand and Dot's fingers with the other, and he was looking back and forth between us with the concentrated attention of someone who has just discovered that the world contains more people than he previously accounted for and is revising his understanding accordingly. "Come inside," I said. "Both of you." Leo fell asleep at 7:43. I know the exact time, because I had been watching the clock above the workbench, the old one that ran 3 minutes fast, with the particular attention of a man responsible for another person's sleep for the first time in 38 years, and acutely aware of how much he did not remember about the mechanics of it. But Leo, it turned out, required very little from me in this regard. He had been fed and bathed and placed in the white oak cradle with the blanket Dot had brought, and he had looked up at the pine ceiling of the small room I had prepared for him, fresh white paint. The cardinal watercolor on the wall, afternoon, light replaced now by the soft glow of a lamp. I had moved from the kitchen, and he had simply closed his eyes and gone to sleep with the uncomplicated trust of someone who had decided the place was acceptable and saw no reason to argue about it. I stood in the doorway for a while after his breathing steadied. The cradle held him the way I had built it, to hold him level solid, the oak frame carrying his weight without a single creak. The pine panels had warmed in the weeks since I'd brought the cradle back from Julian's basement, and the room smelled of wood and the faint sweetness of the baby shampoo Cassandra had packed in the bag she left by the door. I went back to the workshop. I had been meaning for 2 weeks to clean out the old desk in the corner the roll top that had been my father's, that I had inherited along with the workshop property, and had never fully sorted, because sorting it meant dealing with 30 years of accumulated paper, and I had always found other things to do instead. But Leo's arrival had made the desk's corner the obvious place for the small changing table I had built over the past 3 days, and the desk needed to move, and moving it meant finally opening the drawers. I worked through them methodically. The bottom 2 held what I expected: old receipts, maintenance records for equipment. I no longer owned a hand-drawn site map from a property inspection in 1997 that I could not remember drawing but recognized my own handwriting on. I set these aside for the recycling bin and moved to the middle drawer, which held pencils and a broken tape measure and a small jar of brass screws that had been sitting there so long they had oxidized to a uniform dark brown. The top drawer stuck. I worked it loose with a firm pull, and it came open with the particular resistance of wood that has swollen and settled over many years into a fit that was never quite right. Inside a folding ruler, a spare chuck key for the drill press, and beneath both of these, pressed flat against the back of the drawer, a white envelope. The envelope was not old, not yellowed, not brittle, not the artifact of decades. It was perhaps 20 years old, the paper still flexible, the seal still faintly adhesive, though it had never been properly closed. On the front in handwriting I recognized immediately, and would have recognized anywhere Dad. Just that. No address, no date. Just Dad and Julian's handwriting from before he had learned to write the way he wrote, now looser, then less controlled, the letters of a young man who had not yet decided what kind of man he was going to be. I sat down on the workbench stool. I held the envelope for a long time without opening it. Through the wall I could hear Leo's breathing, steady, unhurried, the breathing of someone with no unfinished business and no reason to lie awake. Then I opened it. The letter was written on 2 pages torn from a spiral notebook, the left edges still faintly frilled from the perforation. The handwriting was careful in the way young people's handwriting is careful when they are writing something they have thought about, not print, not cursive, but the hybrid of the two that most people settle into in their early 20s and carry for the rest of their lives. Dad, I don't know if I'm going to send this. I probably won't. I'm home for the summer and I keep coming out to the workshop in the mornings the way I used to when I was little, just to sit in it. It smells the same. I didn't expect that things could smell the same when everything else feels different. I've been thinking about what I want, not what I'm studying or what job I'll get. I know you don't worry about that stuff, and I think you're right not to. I mean what I actually want. The underneath part. I think the underneath part is this. I want to be someone you can point to. Not because of you, I know you'd never point to anyone. But I want to be the kind of person who deserves to be pointed to. I want to walk into a room and have it mean something. I'm not sure I know how to do that yet. I'm not sure the thing I'm studying gets me there. But I wanted to write it down somewhere, because writing it down makes it feel like a promise instead of just a thought. I'll figure it out, I think. I just wanted you to know I'm trying. Love, Julian. I read it twice. The second time more slowly than the first, the way you read something, when the first reading has told you that the words deserve more than one pass. From the room next door, Leo made a small sound, not distress, just the sound of a sleeping person, shifting, resettling, finding the next position. The cradle creaked once lightly and went quiet. I folded the letter along its original creases and held it in both hands. I carried the letter into Leo's room. The lamp was low and warm. Leo was on his left side, one small fist curled near his chin, his breathing the slow and absolute breathing of someone with no unfinished business. The white oak cradle held him without a sound, I lifted the edge of Dot's blanket, soft, worn at the corners, the way things get when they have been genuinely used, and placed the folded letter underneath it, at the foot of the cradle, where the pine panels curved upward, and the wood was warmest from his body heat. I was not forgiving Julian. Forgiveness is not a moment. It is a direction. You do not arrive at it. You simply keep moving toward it one day at a time, and the only thing that matters is that you have not stopped moving. What I was doing was simpler. I was giving Leo the letter because he deserved to know that his father at 20 had wanted to be good. The letter had never truly been addressed to me. It belonged here now, in the place where his grandfather had tried to give him the safest possible beginning. I tucked the blanket back. Leo did not stir. The weeks that followed were the simplest I had known in years. Leo woke at 6, and I woke with him. We sat in the workshop in the early mornings, his milk warming on the stove, mine black while I worked, and he watched from his bouncing chair with the focused attention of someone filing things away for later. One evening in November, I was finishing the Staunton rocking chair, when Leo pulled himself to standing for the first time, gripping the workbench leg, and looked up at me with pure astonishment. "Well," I said, "there you go." He sat down hard on the concrete and looked at the ceiling, and then at me, and his face broke into the widest, most unguarded smile I had seen from another person in longer than I could measure. I set down the sandpaper. I picked him up. That night, after Leo was asleep, I went back to the workshop. I picked up the smoothing plane, the same one I had set down the morning I finished the cradle 9 months and a lifetime ago, and I went back to work. Not because anything needed finishing, because the work was there and my hands knew what to do with it, and sometimes that is enough. The workshop smelled of pine and linseed oil, and the faint warmth of a sleeping child coming through the wall. I worked until midnight. Then I set the plane down, turned off the bench light, and stood in the dark for a moment, listening. From the next room, Leo's breathing. Slow, even untroubled. The cradle did not creak. I had built it to last. It was lasting. I turned off the last light and went to bed. And for the first time in longer than I could measure, the house felt exactly the right size. I have thought a lot about what this story taught me. Not about justice, not about what I was owed, but about what happens when a man spends so long being invisible that the people closest to him forget he exists, and what happens when that invisibility suddenly ends. If I could say one thing to anyone watching this, don't do what I did. Don't spend decades swallowing your worth to keep the peace. Don't wait for a magazine cover to prove your value to someone who should have seen it all along. The people who truly love you shouldn't need evidence. I believe, and I say this, having lived long enough to mean it, that God doesn't waste a quiet life. Every year I spent in that workshop, every piece of wood I shaped every silent morning with my coffee and my tools was building something. I just didn't know yet what it was building toward. In the end, family justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it arrives slowly, the way good wood cures, without announcement, without drama, simply becoming what it was always meant to be. These revenge stories about family often end in fire. Mine ended with a child asleep in a cradle I built with my own hands. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. I'd love to know what you would have done differently. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Some stories ahead contain fictional elements created for the purpose of reflection and life lessons. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. Find what speaks to your heart instead.